Hi guys, it's Mr. Ashley coming at you, talking to you guys today about what is a government. Last class, you guys did a couple of readings for me pertaining to what is sovereignty and what is the role of a government. So today we're talking about the different how government comes to be and what government actually does. What you guys are going to do today is I'm going to give you guys this YouTube video, and I'm also going to give you the actual PowerPoint, the actual Google Slides today that you can follow along with. I want you guys to take some 2-column notes. You can do this either a hard copy on paper and pen with paper and pen, or you guys can take this with your computer on a Word document or whatever whatever you're using. But let's go ahead and let's look at some of these ideas here. So the first thing we're talking to talk about is the state. So I know what you're probably imagining right now. The state is like Connecticut, it's Massachusetts, Maryland, Florida. Those are states. And you're not wrong. Those are states. But when we talk about states, oftentimes we're talking about a bigger picture. A state, we're talking about the world, is not just a small state within the country of the United States. The states include other nations. So for example, the United States is a state. We have North Korea is a state. Australia is a state. England is a state. And we even have states within those states. So we talk about the United States being a state, right? So we have Connecticut, just like you're thinking about. We have Massachusetts and Florida and Georgia, all our states. And we even have states within those other states, like New York City is a state. Montville is a state. Boston is a state. So what makes a state a state? There's a few things that every state needs to have. The state needs to have a population of people. You can't have a government, you can't have a nation, you can't have a city or a state without people. These people need to live within a certain boundary. So they need to live in Montville, in what Montville looks like on a map. Right? You have to live in the United States in order to be a part of the state of the United States. If you live in North Korea, you're a part of the North Korea state. If you live outside of these boundaries, you don't belong to any other state other than the ones you are currently in. And the other important thing about the state is that these states can create their own laws, right? If you are in a country, like let's say you go to Guam. Guam is controlled by the United States, so Guam is not a state, right? The state is the United States. So if you're in Guam, the state you live in is actually the United States. We're talking about the nation you live in the United States. You might actually reside in Guam, but Guam is not its own country. The other thing that every government needs to have is a population. So a population is the amount of people within that state. And when we talk about a population, we're going to break it up into different categories. How many people live in rural or urban environments? So if we're talking about rural environments, that's like the country, right? That's like the South, that's like the Midwest, that's the flyover states. If we're talking about an urban environment, we're talking about cities. We're talking about places like Boston, New York, London. Those kinds of places are urban environments. We're talking about the populations within those areas as well. How many people live in the country versus how many people live in urban environments in the cities. We're also going to talk about culture when we're talking about populations. What do people celebrate? What do people do? What religions do they practice? Those kinds of things. How do people live daily lives? That's going to be a part of population. Population also depicts the wealth of people. So do you have a high population of impoverished people, people who don't have a lot of money, don't have a lot of resources? Do you have a high population of wealthy people, people who are well off? We also have populations of language, right? So we have, in the United States, most people speak English, but we also have people that speak Spanish and Chinese and, all these other languages. So we also have populations of languages as well. And populations of education go along with that as well. So we have a whole range, especially in the United States, of people with different levels of education. We have people who, complete high school or get a GED. We have people who get college educated, maybe a associate's degree or a bachelor's degree or a master's degree. Some people become doctors, that sort of thing. So all these different factors here lead up to the population of the people. We want to know not just how many people are in an area, not just how many people are being governed, but what their demographics look like. So where are they from? What do they celebrate? How well off are they? What do they speak? And what kind of educational background do they come from? Governments also have certain territories that they can rule over. So, for example, the United States can make laws for the United States. They can't make laws for Canada, right? Canada makes laws for Canada. The United States can make laws for any territory that it controls. So that includes the 50 states, that includes Puerto Rico, that includes Guam, that includes all these other areas that they control. So this is the area where rules are going to apply. They apply in set boundaries. Like I just said, the United States cannot make laws for Canada. The boundary is the border between the United States and Canada. Boundaries are also not always agreed upon. Oftentimes, we'll see disputes over different boundaries. So, in U.S. history, we've had disputes over Texas. We've had disputes over California and Alaska and Louisiana. And sometimes these disputes are settled through war. We'll see, like Texas was settled through war. We acquired Texas in the Texas-American War. And we have others where we acquire land through negotiations and purchase. So, for example, Alaska, the territory that was Alaska, is now was purchased from Russia. We bought that from Russia. Or the area that was called Louisiana, which expanded from where Louisiana is almost to the entire Midwest of the United States, was actually bought from France. So there are several ways that you can go about acquiring boundaries, but it's important to understand that a government's rules, a government's laws, and a government's authority only applies to the territory in which it controls. It's also important to know that governments need to have sovereignty. They need to have the ability to rule that territory. In order to have the ability to rule that territory, you need to be able to be the one to decide how things work within those boundaries. So, for example, some countries like Somalia, their governments are so weak that they can't actually tell people how to live, right? They can't make rules. They can't make laws. Because the government is so weak, they don't actually rule that country. They don't have sovereignty. All right. Other ways that you can lose sovereignty is if you get controlled by another country. So, for example, we talked about Guam, correct? And how Guam doesn't really have the ability to run itself. It doesn't have sovereignty. The United States controls Guam. Puerto Rico does not exactly have sovereignty. The United States controls Puerto Rico. It's not its own country. It's not a state. The United States tells it what its laws are and how it can be run. And finally, what does a government do, right? So all these other things, this is how a government operates, but what do they actually do? A government is what is essentially who makes and who enforces those laws. We talked about right before we, right before we left school, before we started social distancing and distance learning and all that kind of stuff, we talked about monarchies, kings and queens, and how they run their governments. We talked about, oligarchies, and we talked about democracies and how the people can run the government, right? So the government is who makes and who enforces those laws. And a government has 4 roles. And if you remember from the reading last class, a government has to protect the people. So that is, does your government have a military? Can it fight? Can it defend itself in case it's attacked? Can it create its own laws? Again, places like Somalia, their government is so weak, they can't create their own laws. The United States can create its own laws, right? So the other thing here is, can it keep order? It's not enough to just create laws, but how do you enforce those laws? How do you make sure that people are doing what they're supposed to be doing? So do you have a police force? Do you have fire departments? Do you have those kinds of things that are going to enforce the laws that you make? And the final thing that every government has to do is it has to be able to provide a service, right? So one of the services that the United States provides is roads. They create highways. They create, the cities and states and the country create different types of roads for us. There's other types of services as well. We have welfare, we have social security, we have education services for those who need them. We have all sorts of different services for people, and governments have to provide those 4 things in order to be successful, all right? So I hope that you guys got a lot out of today's class. I'm going to do my best to create more videos like this for you guys. Please let me know if you think this is helpful, and please remember to do the question that I'm going to leave for you guys. Again, that is how I'm going to be figuring out who participated in today's class. If you do not do the question, you will not get credit for today's class. So you need to do the question, okay? Guys, have a great rest of your day. Stay happy, stay healthy. Salud.